I think that that's one of the things that's happening in America is that we've bought in so much to this sense that I win or it's all over. And if I lose, it's the end. That we're creating this just sense of emergency that is ripping Americans apart.
And on the Michael Medved Show, it is always a pleasure to welcome back my friend David French, who is a distinguished commentator, a columnist for the New York Times. He writes about religion, about values, about culture, about armed conflict. He is a decorated veteran of recent conflicts for the United States, and basically the future of where we are and where we're going. If we can begin, David, you have a terrific column, which I hope everybody will read. And the title that they gave it is a little bit confusing, which is what happens.
It is a little double meaning, yes.
What happens if you refuse to recognize we are in a death spiral? And you do not believe we are in a death spiral. You make that very clear at the very beginning of your article. You say this about the new right. The new right, you say, contrasts its vision of a glorious past with a miserable present. This month, Matt Walsh, a popular right-wing podcaster with millions of social media followers, wrote, "It is an empirical fact," he said, "that basically everything in our day-to-day lives has gotten worse. The quality of everything, food, clothing, entertainment, air travel, roads, traffic, infrastructure, housing, etc. It has all declined in recent years, plural, in observable ways." Okay, what's wrong with what Matt Walsh had to say here?
Almost everything. Almost everything. But it really does encapsulate a worldview that I've encountered in parts of the right, which is there was this glorious, glorious past that they took from us. But the reality is today we live longer, we have higher wages, we live in larger and more luxurious homes, we have more civil liberties, including more free speech, more religious freedom, we have lower divorce rates, we have much lower abortion rates, although they've increased a little bit in the last couple of years, but much lower abortion rates than at the worst, much lower crime rates, including murder rates, rape, and violent crime. And by a number of empirical measures, a lot is getting better. Now, to be clear, some things are getting worse. So, for example, the unemployment rate ticked up today. And we do have a housing affordability problem in many cities. So it's not like we live in utopia. We never have, we never will. But this sort of idea that we're locked in a death spiral in terminal decline is just belied by a lot of empirical facts.
Okay, and how do you try to reach young people who are convinced that the Matt Walshes of this world are right, that they have every reason for gripe and grudge and complaint rather than gratitude for where we stand in the United States of America?
Well, before I talk about how we reach them, I'll tell you how you don't reach them. And that's the way when I've been talking about these issues over the last several years, what I've found is that even when you relay empirical facts that contradict the doom narrative, they'll respond with anecdotes, with individual things that exist that really make them angry. And sometimes those things are real, or sometimes those things are false. But the bottom line is what you're dealing with is a very emotionally rooted problem that is not necessarily susceptible to a fact-based argument. And so then what do you have to do is you have to get at the emotionally rooted problem. And I think part of that emotionally rooted problem, Michael, is actually related not to the kids, but to the parents, that in a lot of ways, the younger generation is responding to the cues that the older generation has put out. We haven't been able to handle our smartphones. We haven't been able to handle disagreement online.
I don't even know how to operate it.
Yeah. And so when I was younger and we had major conflicts in the world, I could look to my parents and see them as sources of stability. That, yeah, they weren't Pollyanna-ish. I mean, the Cold War could be scary at times, but they were also calm. And here's what I think happened. I think we lost our calm and our kids picked it up. And so I think that one of the key ways for us to heal the future generations is to, in many ways, heal ourselves, to be able to take, as older people who should be able to mentor and lead. We have all too often just been a big part of the problem. And so I think a lot of what has to happen is America's younger generations need to see America's older generations behave better. Because if you're younger, you're going to take cues from those who are older and you're going to magnify it. You're going to amplify it. And I think that is what's happened.
And when you talk about behaving better, one of the great religious values is gratitude,
Yes.
is expressing, even when there are terrible things that happen in the world. And I thought that there was a very interesting quote that you had in here, is that a lot of people who think that we are in this death spiral and the end is coming point to the idea that we actually have drag queens who go
Hmm.
to local libraries and do readings for kids. Now, I agree that's awful. I
Yeah.
would never sanction that.
No.
However, there's an answer to the idea of the proliferation of drag queens, and the answer is brilliant. Give it.
Well, this comes from my friend Kevin Williamson, and he says, over time, we've had more drag queens and less slavery, which kind of puts things in perspective, doesn't it? So the past wasn't so golden, and you don't even have to go to slavery. We had Jim Crow, for example. We had a lot of things, even, they'll often pull out pictures from the 1950s of sort of an idyllic upper middle class or wealthy lifestyle that existed in the 1950s and implied that that's what we all had when it was far from that. I mean, far in the 1950s, a lot of people still didn't have indoor plumbing in parts of America. I mean,
Well,
this was
not just that, to integrate high schools and colleges, they had to call out the National
had
Guard
to call it the National Guard. Yes.
to
So,
protect students who had every right to go to a particular high school, but were being kept from doing so because of their darker complexion.
and the idea that life is worse now than it was then when the National Guard is protecting like Black 8-year-olds from mob violence. I mean, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that are absolutely crystal clear when you look at the historical record. But again, I keep going back to this. This younger generation is picking up cues from us. And I went and I showed some statistics from 2014, 11 years ago, before Trump entered the scene, that showed how much Americans were hating each other, even in 2014. And you can go all the way back to the end of the Cold War and the rise of the culture wars and the fighting between right and left during the Clinton years, for example, to show that, at this time of extraordinary peace and prosperity, we began to introduce an enormous amount of negative polarization where we were turning against each other. And we're tasting the bitter fruit of decades of polarization right now.
Okay, to keep this in context, and I want to go on to this, President Trump, and I believe he said it again in the last 48 hours, that we have actually arrived at a golden age for America. Now, that's not true, and I don't think you think it's true. But how do you answer that kind of claim that America is now, quote, great again, without contributing to this death spiral narrative that you decry?
Well, there's a giant gap between death spiral and golden age. Like these are your two poles. It's like North Pole and South Pole, and there's a there's some range between there. So you can say, for example, that America and much of the developed world is living by the big sweep of history in a golden age. Absolute poverty is down, life expectancy is up. So if you're going to look at sort of the big sweep of history, you'd really rather live in 2025
Yeah, we have
than almost.
vaccines today, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you'd really rather live in 2025 than almost any other time in world history for a million different reasons. But at the same time, the question is, are we getting better or are we getting worse? In other words, are we progressing or are we regressing? And the thing that I would say with Trump, in many material respects, Trump is causing us to regress, and he's causing us to regress in a couple of ways. I mean, one, he's putting some obvious drags on the economy, for example, through tariffs. But in a more profound way, he's creating a sense of regress because if he has one great talent, it is pitting people against each other. And so, one way in which he is causing us to regress is by this very rhetoric that casts all of politics in apocalyptic terms, where it's Trump or it's ruin, it's Trump or it's the devastation of the country. And when you cast things like that, it inflames people to such a degree that the sense of crisis becomes a crisis itself. And here's an analogy that I used, and that is, Michael, I'm sure you remember the old Flight 93 essay from
Oh, sure. Michael
2016.
Anton.
Michael Anton's essay where he said, essentially, like, electing Trump is a risk, but it's either elect Trump or we die, like the country dies. And I said, look, there's a way in which a false sense of crisis can create its own emergency. So let's take his Flight 93 analogy. You think the plane's being hijacked, you storm the cockpit, you choke the pilots, and then you take control and you realize, oh, crud, it was just turbulence. And now I don't know how to fly this plane. Well, you've created your own crisis. And I think that that's one of the things that's happening in America is that we've bought in so much to this sense that I win or it's all over. And if I lose, it's the end, that we're creating this just sense of emergency that is ripping Americans apart. And so, there's a lot of examples of this kind of overreaction to events creating crises. And you just see it again and again and again in history. I mean, August 1914, for example, is that's an example of when the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand turns into, until then, the most catastrophic war in world history. We're very good as people at overreacting, and overreaction can be very dangerous. And so
Okay,
that's what I was trying to do, is temper that sense.
let's speak of a recent reaction that's very controversial. Rob Reiner, truly beloved comedian and director, and someone who was revered in Hollywood for his fundamental decency. He's murdered by his son, apparently. And President Trump found it necessary to offer a reaction where he basically said he had it coming because
Yeah.
he had opposed Trump. He was a victim of Trump derangement syndrome, as if that had anything at all to do with his murder. And then yesterday, Trump was asked about that, whether he stood by that statement, which has been criticized by most Republicans. And he said he did because he was not a fan of Rob Reiner because Rob Reiner didn't support him. What do
Yeah.
you make of that?
So that's a perfect example of like creating your own crisis. So the easiest thing to do in the world when somebody dies is to either shut up or say something nice. Like that. This is the easiest thing you can possibly imagine. All right. But what does he do? No, it's like he pulls the pin on a cultural hand grenade and just throws it towards America. And he creates this just utterly deranged, rambling string of insults that isn't just disrespectful to the families of the fallen, but it's just completely false and inflammatory at the same time. It's like, how can you make something both false and perfectly inflammatory? Well, he did it. And so then once again, you get into this whole thing you see online where Trump's defenders will say, well, there's liberals who are mean about Charlie Kirk. And you just get back into this cycle because you have to defend your side against all comers. And now, thankfully, you saw some Republicans breaking ranks with Trump here. And I think that that's part of a trend. I think his sort of hold over the party that's been so tight for so long is starting to slip.
Do you think that Susie Wiles is one of those Republicans who is starting to reconsider some of the golden age rhetoric of the MAGA crowd?
I got to say that this is the absolute taboo for a pundit. I have no idea what's going on there. Like, I'm supposed to have a take on this. I'm supposed to have an idea about this. We're in uncharted waters, Michael. A sitting chief of staff, like, rips her boss and everyone around him on the record in public.
10
I've not seen
interviews.
it. I've never seen this before. So literally, I just have to confess to your audience, like, I'm still processing this. I don't know what to say about it.
Well, again, what do you think Trump is going to say about it? Do you think she can continue as chief of staff for the second Trump administration?
Let me put it this way. She did the one thing in this Trump administration that I think is most likely to lead to termination, which is disloyalty. We know that incompetence and corruption are totally fine with this administration so long as you're loyal. You can bring the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic on a Signal chat and disclose war plans before the war starts, and you're fine as long as you hate the media enough. But you can't turn on Trump, and I'm very curious. I mean, but it's also weirdly in this second term, he seems to be very focused on not firing people. His first term, he had a lot of turnover, and I think that he regrets that. And so he's wanting more stability now. So I don't know. Like I said, this is uncharted waters for me. I mean, we're watching a live political social experiment. What happens when a chief of staff turns on her own boss?
Who do you think is the top candidate for the next firing by President Trump? Robert Kennedy, Pete Hegseth? Who do you nominate?
Whoever annoys Trump without also annoying the media. Because if the media is calling for the firing, I think Trump digs in. If he's been mad for his own reasons, I think he'll get rid of somebody. So I think, he's had a number of cabinet and sort of cabinet equivalent officials who've done terrible and embarrassing and incompetent things. But as long as they keep both arms wrapped around Trump, they've been fine. But those who turn on Trump, that's why I'm very, very interested to see what happens with Susie Wiles.
Well, again, it is a dramatic situation. And also, very quickly, as a decorated veteran of armed services for the United States, are we heading to war with Venezuela?
By all external indicators, it looks like we are. Troop movements, ship movements. It could be an elaborate bluff. I mean, we're already engaging in preliminary armed conflict, preliminary strikes with these drug boats. So if you were going to see the same kind of maneuvering from another country aimed at a smaller country, you would say they're prepping for war. But obviously, he's not gone to Congress. He's not announced his intentions. We just don't know.
And again, that is one of the questions that David French, as time moves on, will help us answer. His most recent column, which is extremely significant and very powerful, is posted at our website at MichaelMedved.com. David, keep it up. We need your voice and appreciate your voice, which is a tremendous benefit to this greatest nation on God's green earth.